The gunshot shattered our perfect morning. My 3-week-old daughter Emma lay dying in my arms, blood soaking her white onesie. The HOA Karen who shot her over rose bushes had no idea she just made an enemy of a deadly Navy SEAL. My revenge would be surgical, complete, and devastating. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun painted golden streaks across our front yard as I stepped outside, cradling my 3-week-old daughter Emma in my arms. My wife Sarah was watering her roses, humming softly while our baby slept peacefully against my chest. After 12 years in the Navy SEALs, I thought I had seen every kind of danger. I was wrong. Such a beautiful morning, Sarah whispered, her eyes sparkling with the joy of new motherhood. We had moved to Willowbrook Estates 6 months ago, seeking the quiet suburban life I had dreamed of during my deployments overseas. The neighborhood seemed perfect: tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and friendly neighbors who waved from their porches. Emma had been born after years of trying. Sarah had suffered 3 miscarriages before Emma came into our lives like a miracle. Those tiny fingers that wrapped around mine, those perfect little sounds she made while sleeping, after all the horrors I had witnessed in Afghanistan and Iraq, my daughter was pure innocence. She was hope. She was everything good in the world. Look at her sleeping so peacefully, Sarah said, reaching over to touch Emma's soft cheek. She's dreaming of angels. I had never believed in God until Emma was born. Holding her for the first time, seeing her perfect features, feeling her tiny heartbeat against my chest, it was impossible not to believe in something divine. This little girl was my redemption, my chance to protect something beautiful in a world I had seen too much ugliness in. The roses Sarah was tending were a gift from my mother when Emma was born. Every little girl needs a garden, she had said, planting the pink and white blooms with tears of joy in her eyes. Those roses represented new life, new hope, new beginnings. That illusion shattered in an instant. Excuse me. The voice cut through the morning peace like a blade. I turned to see Margaret Hayes, our HOA president, marching across the street with her clipboard clutched against her chest. At 62, she was a woman who had made controlling others her life's mission. Her perfectly styled gray hair and expensive pantsuit couldn't hide the coldness in her eyes. Mrs. Hayes, I said calmly, instinctively adjusting my hold on Emma. Good morning. Don't you good morning me, Mr. Thompson, she snapped, her voice rising. I've been watching you, and I'm sick of your family's violations of our community standards. Sarah looked up from her flowers, confusion replacing her peaceful expression. What violations? We've followed every rule in the HOA handbook. Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. Your rose bushes are 2 inches too tall. Your mailbox is the wrong shade of blue. And don't get me started on that hideous baby stroller you leave on your porch. I had encountered Margaret Hayes several times since moving to Willowbrook Estates. She was the kind of woman who measured grass height with a ruler and reported neighbors for parking their cars 1 inch over property lines. The HOA handbook she carried everywhere was thick as a phone book, filled with ridiculous rules about everything from the acceptable colors of doormats to the precise angles of garden gnomes. Mrs. Hayes, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, we followed the HOA guidelines exactly. I measured the roses myself, and our mailbox was approved by the architectural committee. Don't lecture me about the rules, she snapped. I've been president of this HOA for 15 years. I know what's acceptable and what isn't. Sarah stepped closer, her maternal instincts kicking in as Emma began to stir. Please, you're going to wake the baby. I don't care about your baby. Margaret's voice rose to a shriek. I care about maintaining the standards that make this neighborhood respectable. I felt my jaw tighten. During my military service, I had learned to control my emotions, but something about this woman's tone made my blood simmer. The way she looked at Emma with disgust, as if my daughter was some kind of threat to her precious neighborhood order, triggered something primal in me. Mrs. Hayes, we can discuss any concerns you have, but please lower your voice. You're disturbing the baby. I'll speak however I want on MY Street, she screamed, her face turning red. You military types think you're so special, don't you? Coming into our neighborhood and thinking the rules don't apply to you. The hatred in her voice was unmistakable. I had encountered prejudice before, but never directed at my sleeping infant daughter. Emma stirred in my arms, her tiny face scrunching up as Margaret's shouts reached her ears. Please, Sarah said, stepping closer to us. You're scaring the baby. I don't care about your baby, Margaret shrieked. I care about property values. I care about maintaining standards. People like you are ruining everything we've built here. That's when I saw it, the small pistol she pulled from her purse. Time seemed to slow just as it had during combat missions. My training kicked in, but I was holding Emma, and Sarah was directly in the line of fire. I couldn't move fast enough to protect them both. "Margaret, put the gun down," I said, my voice steady despite the terror gripping my heart. "You want to see what happens to people who don't follow the rules?" she snarled, her finger finding the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the quiet neighborhood like thunder. Sarah screamed as the bullet tore through Emma's tiny chest, the impact spinning me around. My daughter, my beautiful, innocent daughter, went limp in my arms, her white onesie instantly soaked with blood. Time stopped. The world went silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I had been shot at countless times during my military service, but this was different. This was my child. This was my everything. Emma's eyes, those perfect blue eyes that looked so much like Sarah's, stared up at me. They were wide with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why her daddy's face was so scared. Then, as I watched in horror, the light began to fade from them. "Emma? Emma?" Sarah's voice broke as she ran to us, her hands shaking as she touched our baby's face. Oh God, please no." I dropped to my knees, my training warring with my devastation. I pressed my hand against Emma's wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but I could feel her life slipping away. The tiny chest that had risen and fallen so peacefully just moments before was now still. The little hands that had gripped my finger with such surprising strength were limp. "No, no, no," I whispered, holding her closer. "Stay with me, baby girl. Daddy's here. Daddy's got you." But even as I spoke the words, I knew it was too late. The bullet had torn through her heart, and there was nothing I could do. All my training, all my experience saving lives under fire, and I couldn't save the one life that mattered most. "Call 911. I shouted to the neighbors who had emerged from their houses. Margaret stood frozen, the gun still in her hand, her face pale with shock as if she couldn't believe what she had just done. I didn't mean," she stammered. "You shot my baby." Sarah collapsed beside me, gathering Emma's still form against her chest. "You killed my baby." The ambulance arrived within minutes, but I already knew it was too late. The EMTs worked frantically, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they tried to restart Emma's heart. I stood back, holding Sarah as she sobbed, watching strangers fight for my daughter's life. "Sir, we need to get her to the hospital immediately," one of the paramedics said, but I could see the hopelessness in his eyes. He had seen enough trauma to know when someone was beyond saving. "Is she going to be okay?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Please tell me she's going to be okay." The paramedic looked at me and I saw the answer in his expression. I had seen that look before on the faces of medics in Afghanistan when they couldn't save a fallen soldier. It was the look of someone who had to deliver the impossible news. At 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, my 3-week-old daughter was pronounced dead in my arms. The doctor at the hospital spoke words about massive internal trauma and insufficient blood volume, but all I heard was silence. The world had gone quiet, as if someone had turned off the sound. Emma's tiny body looked so peaceful on the hospital bed, as if she were just sleeping. Sarah brushed her dark hair away from her face, whispering lullabies through her tears. I held my wife and my dead daughter, feeling something inside me break that would never heal. "I'm so sorry," the doctor said quietly. "We did everything we could. Everything they could. Everything I could. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough." The next hours passed in a blur of police statements, crime scene tape, and Sarah's inconsolable sobs. Margaret was arrested, her hands cuffed behind her back as she was led to the patrol car. She kept muttering about property values and violations, as if those words could somehow justify what she had done. "I'm sorry for your loss," Detective Rodriguez said, his voice gentle but professional. "We'll make sure she pays for this." I nodded, but words felt impossible. How do you respond when someone tells you they're sorry your child was murdered? How do you process the fact that your baby died because of rose bushes and mailbox colors? That night, I held Sarah as she cried herself to sleep, her body shaking with grief. I stared at the ceiling, my mind cycling through every detail of the morning, searching for something I could have done differently. In Afghanistan, I had saved countless lives. At home, I couldn't save the one that mattered most. The funeral was held 3 days later at St. Mary's Catholic Church. The tiny white coffin at the front of the church seemed impossibly small, dwarfed by the enormous arrangements of flowers that filled the space. Our families flew in from across the country, their faces etched with disbelief and sorrow. My mother, who had planted the roses in our garden, could barely speak through her tears. "She was supposed to outlive us all," she whispered, holding on to my father for support. Babies aren't supposed to die. Grandmothers are supposed to die first. Sarah's parents were destroyed. Her father, a man who had never shown emotion in my presence, broke down completely when he saw Emma's coffin. She was so perfect, he sobbed. She was going to be a doctor, just like her mother always wanted to be. The church was packed with people whose lives Emma had touched in her brief time on earth. Neighbors who had only seen her for a few minutes were there, crying as if they had lost their own child. My old Navy buddies flew in from across the country, men who had seen combat and death but couldn't handle the sight of such a small coffin. Father McKenna, who had baptized Emma just 2 weeks before her death, struggled to find words of comfort. Sometimes, he said, his voice breaking, God calls his angels home early. Emma was too pure for this world, too innocent to stay among us. I wanted to stand up and scream. If God had wanted Emma home, why did he let Margaret Hayes pull the trigger? Why did he let evil disguised as suburban respectability destroy something so beautiful? She was so perfect, Sarah whispered as we stood beside the grave. 3 weeks. She only had 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 21 days. That's all the time my daughter had been given to exist in this world. She had never seen a sunset, never felt grass beneath her feet, never heard the ocean waves I had planned to show her. All she had known was the warmth of our arms and the sound of our voices telling her she was loved. The cemetery was filled with flowers, but I couldn't stop staring at the pink roses from our garden, the ones Margaret had complained about, the ones that had somehow triggered her murderous rage. They looked so innocent now, so beautiful, mocking the stupidity of what had happened. As the dirt was thrown onto Emma's coffin, I made a promise to my daughter. Margaret Hayes would pay for what she had done. She would lose everything just as we had lost everything. She would suffer the way we were suffering, and she would never hurt another innocent child. The other mourners spoke about justice and healing, but all I could think about was revenge. Margaret Hayes had stolen everything from us in a moment of petty rage. She deserved to lose everything in return. The legal proceedings began immediately. Margaret was charged with first-degree murder, but her expensive lawyer was already talking about temporary insanity and reduced charges. The media attention was overwhelming. News vans lined our street, reporters shouting questions about the HOA shooting and the baby killer. Military hero loses daughter to neighborhood dispute, read one headline. Another proclaimed, HOA president shoots infant over garden violation. The story went viral, but no amount of attention could bring Emma back. During the preliminary hearing, I sat in the gallery watching Margaret's lawyer paint her as a stressed community volunteer who had simply snapped under pressure. They talked about her 40 years of service to the neighborhood, her charity work, her standing in the community. They made her sound like a victim. Your Honor, her lawyer said smoothly, Mrs. Hayes has no criminal record. She's a pillar of the community who made a tragic mistake in a moment of extreme emotional distress. I wanted to stand up and scream. A mistake? She had pulled a gun on a baby. She had looked into Emma's innocent face and pulled the trigger. That wasn't a mistake, it was evil. But I remained silent, my hands clenched in my lap. I had learned patience during my military service, and I would need every ounce of it now. The trial was set for 4 months later. In the meantime, Margaret was released on $1 million bail, paid for by her wealthy sister. She returned to her house across the street, acting as if nothing had happened. I watched from my window as she tended her garden, organized neighborhood meetings, and went about her daily routine while my daughter lay cold in the ground. That's when I decided justice wouldn't be enough. I wanted revenge. I began planning with the same methodical precision I had used in military operations. Margaret Hayes thought she knew who she was dealing with, but she had no idea what a Navy SEAL was capable of when someone hurt his family. First, I needed intelligence. I spent weeks studying Margaret's habits, her schedule, her weaknesses. She went to the country club every Tuesday for bridge. She volunteered at the animal shelter on Thursdays. She had a standing appointment at the beauty salon every Saturday morning. More importantly, I learned about her secrets. Margaret Hayes wasn't the upstanding citizen she pretended to be. She had been embezzling money from the HOA for years, using the funds to pay for her lavish lifestyle. She had been having an affair with her neighbor's husband for the past 18 months. She had been filing false insurance claims and hiding assets from the IRS. The woman who had killed my daughter over neighborhood violations was a criminal herself. I gathered evidence methodically, using skills I had learned in covert operations. I photographed documents, recorded conversations, and built a comprehensive case against her. But I wanted more than just to expose her crimes. I wanted to destroy her life completely. The trial began on a cold Monday in November. Sarah and I sat in the front row, holding hands as the prosecutor laid out the case. The evidence was overwhelming: security footage showing Margaret pulling the gun, multiple witnesses, her own confession at the scene. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, "this is a case about a woman who valued property more than human life. Margaret Hayes shot and killed a 3-week-old baby because she was angry about rose bushes." Margaret's lawyer countered with the insanity defense, claiming she had suffered a mental break due to stress and medication. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about her deteriorating mental state and the pressures of community leadership. I testified on the third day, describing the morning Emma died. I spoke calmly and clearly, letting the jury see the pain in my eyes without breaking down. I talked about my daughter's smile, her first laugh, the dreams Sarah and I had for her future. She was going to be a doctor, I said, my voice steady. Sarah had already picked out medical schools. Emma was going to save lives just like her mother does as a nurse. Instead, she's dead because Mrs. Hayes couldn't tolerate roses that were 2 inches too tall. The jury was moved to tears, but I could see Margaret's supporters in the gallery nodding sympathetically when her lawyer spoke. They still saw her as a victim of circumstances rather than a cold-blooded killer. That's when I put my plan into action. I had been feeding information to investigative journalist Lisa Chen, who had been covering the trial. She had the resources and connections to expose Margaret's crimes in a way that would cause maximum damage. On the day Margaret was supposed to testify in her own defense, Lisa's article went live. HOA Baby Killer's Secret Life of Crime was the headline. The article detailed Margaret's embezzlement, her affair, her insurance fraud, and her tax evasion. It painted a picture of a woman who had been living a double life while presenting herself as a moral authority. The courtroom erupted when the article was published. Margaret's lawyer asked for a recess, but the damage was done. The jury saw Margaret differently now, not as a stressed community volunteer, but as a criminal who had been judging others while committing crimes herself. But I wasn't finished. I had been in contact with the families of other neighborhood residents who had been harassed by Margaret over the years. The stories they told were horrifying: elderly residents bullied to tears over garden gnomes, young mothers shamed for letting their children play too loudly, minority families subjected to discriminatory enforcement of rules that were ignored when white families broke them. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly Hispanic woman who lived 2 streets over, told me about how Margaret had called the police on her grandson for riding his bicycle on the sidewalk, something white children did every day without consequence. The Martinez family had been fined repeatedly for excessive noise when they had family barbecues, while the Smiths next door regularly hosted loud parties with no complaints. "She made our lives hell," Mrs. Rodriguez said, tears in her eyes. "But we were afraid to speak up. She had so much power, so much influence. We thought no one would believe us." Together, we filed a class action lawsuit against Margaret for harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power. The lawsuit detailed years of psychological warfare Margaret had waged against anyone who didn't meet her standards, or who didn't look like her idea of the perfect neighbor. The legal documentation was damning. Margaret had issued 847 violations in the past 5 years, but 78% of them were against minority families or single mothers. She had never once cited her wealthy friends for identical violations. She had used her position to terrorize those who couldn't fight back. When the local newspaper got hold of the lawsuit, the story exploded. "HOA President's Pattern of Discrimination Exposed" was the headline. The article detailed Margaret's systematic harassment of minority families and her apparent belief that she was the moral arbiter of the neighborhood. The media picked up the story, and suddenly Margaret Hayes became a national symbol of everything wrong with HOA culture. Death threats poured in from around the country. Her house was vandalized with graffiti calling her a baby killer and racist. Her car was keyed. Her mailbox was destroyed. The bridge club she had belonged to for 20 years expelled her. The country club revoked her membership. But I wanted more than just public humiliation. I wanted to see her world burn the way ours had burned. During her testimony, Margaret broke down on the witness stand. Gone was the imperious woman who had terrorized our neighborhood for years. In her place sat a broken shell of a person, her perfect hair disheveled, her expensive makeup smeared with tears and snot. "I just wanted everything to be perfect," she cried, her voice cracking. "I worked so hard to make this neighborhood beautiful, and they were ruining it with their violations. The roses were too tall, the mailbox was the wrong color, the baby stroller was always on the porch." She was trying to justify murdering my daughter over home decor. Even as she broke down, even as she sobbed and begged for forgiveness, She still believed that her petty rules were more important than human life. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, she continued, wiping her nose with a tissue. I just wanted them to follow the rules. I worked so hard to make everything perfect and they were destroying it. The prosecutor's cross-examination was devastating. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had prosecuted murder cases for 15 years, but she later said that Margaret's case was the most infuriating she had ever handled. You went back to issuing violations the day after you were released on bail, didn't you? Walsh asked. I had responsibilities, Margaret stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. More important than the baby you killed? I didn't mean to kill her. But you did. You pointed a gun at a 3-week-old infant and pulled the trigger. Then you went home and wrote up Mrs. Johnson for having the wrong color flowers. Isn't that right? Margaret's face crumpled. I was just trying to maintain standards. Whose standards? The standards that say a baby's life is worth less than the height of rose bushes. No, that's not. I didn't mean. You shot a baby, Mrs. Hayes. You looked at a 3-week-old child and decided she deserved to die because her parents didn't trim their roses to your satisfaction. The courtroom was dead silent. Margaret's sobs echoed off the walls as she realized how her actions sounded when stated so plainly. She had killed an innocent child over flowers, and no amount of crying could make that acceptable. The prosecutor pressed on, her voice rising with righteous anger. After you murdered Emma Thompson, you showed no remorse. You didn't check on the baby you had just shot. You didn't call for help. You stood there with the gun in your hand and complained about property values while a baby died in her father's arms. I was in shock, Margaret whispered. You were in shock? What about the parents who watched their daughter die? What about the mother who held her dead baby? What about the father who couldn't save his own child? Margaret looked at me through her tears, and I saw something I had never seen before, genuine fear. For the first time, she understood that she wasn't the victim in this story. She was the monster. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with the verdict in his hands, his face grim. We find the defendant, Margaret Hayes, guilty of first-degree murder. Sarah collapsed against me, sobbing with relief. Margaret screamed as the bailiff approached with handcuffs. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared with tears. This isn't fair, she shrieked. I served this community for 40 years. I made it better. I made it beautiful. You made it a graveyard, I said quietly as she was led past our row. She turned to look at me and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. Margaret's lawyer pleaded for leniency, citing her age and her decades of community service. Her supporters testified about her charity work and her contributions to the neighborhood. But the family she had terrorized told a different story. They spoke about years of harassment, discriminatory enforcement of rules, and the climate of fear Margaret had created. They described how she had targeted minorities, young families, and anyone who didn't fit her vision of the perfect neighbor. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium with Emma's photograph in my hand. I looked directly at Margaret as I spoke. Your Honor, Margaret Hayes didn't just kill my daughter. She murdered the future. Emma will never take her first steps, speak her first words, or grow up to help others. She will never graduate from school, fall in love, or have children of her own. All of that is gone because Margaret Hayes cared more about the height of rose bushes than the value of human life. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the courtroom. I spent 12 years in the Navy SEALs protecting people like Margaret Hayes. I risked my life so she could live in freedom and safety. In return, she executed my baby daughter in front of my wife. She deserves to spend the rest of her life in prison, thinking about what she took from us. The judge sentenced Margaret to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel came down, Margaret's legs gave out and she collapsed to the floor. The bailiff helped her to her feet, but she was sobbing uncontrollably. Please, she begged, looking at me through the gallery. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I stood up slowly, my eyes never leaving her face. Emma was 3 weeks old. She had never hurt anyone. She never broke any rules. She was perfect, and you killed her because you were angry about flowers. I know, Margaret whispered. I know, and I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Sorry doesn't give us back our daughter. As Margaret was led away in shackles, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served, but Emma was still gone. The woman who had destroyed our family would spend the rest of her life in a concrete cell, but no punishment could undo what she had done. The media covered Margaret's sentencing extensively. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of HOA power and the importance of mental health resources. Margaret's mugshot appeared on magazine covers with headlines like, "The Face of Evil" and "Baby Killer Gets Life." But for me, the real victory wasn't the prison sentence. It was watching Margaret's entire world crumble. Her house was foreclosed on when her crimes were exposed. Her sister, who had paid her bail, disowned her publicly. Her few remaining friends abandoned her. The HOA disbanded, and the neighborhood she had worked so hard to control fell into disrepair. Margaret Hayes had spent 40 years building a perfect facade, and I had destroyed it in a matter of months. She had taken everything from me, so I had taken everything from her. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Margaret in prison. The envelope was stained and wrinkled, as if it had been handled many times before being sent. Her handwriting was shaky, completely different from the precise script she had used to write HOA violations. "Mr. Thompson," she wrote, "I know you have no reason to forgive me, but I need you to know that I think about Emma every day. I see her face in my dreams. I hear her cry when I try to sleep. The other inmates know what I did and they make sure I remember it every day. They call me Baby Killer and spit in my food. I've been beaten 3 times and the guards look the other way. I know I deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I'm suffering too. I would give anything to take back what I did. I would trade my life for hers if I could. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing her miserable existence in prison. She had been placed in protective custody after the 3rd beating, but that meant 23 hours a day in a concrete cell. She had no friends, no visitors, no hope of ever getting out. The woman who had once ruled over a neighborhood with an iron fist was now powerless, vulnerable, and alone. I read the letter once, then burned it in our fireplace. Margaret's suffering would never equal ours, but knowing she was broken gave me some measure of peace. She had destroyed our family in a moment of rage, and now she would spend every remaining day of her life paying for it. The second letter came 3 months later, more desperate than the first. Margaret wrote about how she had tried to hang herself with her bedsheets but had been found by the guards. She begged for forgiveness, for some sign that her suffering meant something, for any indication that she might someday be redeemed. I burned that letter too and the ones that followed. Margaret Hayes wanted absolution, but I had none to give. She had killed my daughter, and no amount of suffering could bring Emma back. The final letter arrived on the 1st anniversary of Emma's death. Margaret's handwriting was barely legible, and the paper was covered in tear stains and what looked like blood. "She would have been 1 year old today," Margaret wrote. "I think about all the birthdays she'll never have, all the Christmas mornings she'll never see, all the hugs she'll never give. I took all of that away because I was angry about flowers. I was angry about flowers and I killed a baby. I killed your baby. I killed everything good in the world because I cared more about rules than people. I don't ask for forgiveness anymore. I just wanted you to know that I remember her. I remember Emma. I remember what I took from you. This letter I kept. Not out of forgiveness but as a reminder of what justice looked like." Margaret Hayes had finally understood the magnitude of what she had done, and that understanding was destroying her from the inside. Sarah and I eventually moved away from Willowbrook Estates. We couldn't bear to live across from the house where Emma's killer had lived. We bought a small farm in the countryside where there were no HOA rules, no neighbors to complain about our choices and no one to judge us. On Emma's 1st birthday, we planted a garden in her memory. We chose the tallest roses we could find, the brightest colors, the most beautiful varieties. We let them grow wild and free the way Emma should have been allowed to grow. Sarah had been seeing a therapist, slowly working through her grief and trauma. She still had nightmares about that morning, still woke up reaching for a baby who would never be there. But she was healing, day by day, building a life that honored Emma's memory without being consumed by it. "She would have loved these roses," Sarah said, kneeling beside the garden as she planted a new bush. "She would have tried to grab them with her little hands." We talked about Emma as if she were still with us, sharing stories about the 3 weeks we had with her. The way she would grip our fingers so tightly when she was nursing. The little sounds she made when she was content. The way her eyes would follow Sarah's voice around the room. Do you think she knew how much we loved her? Sarah asked one evening as we sat in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "She knew," I said, reaching for my wife's hand. Every second of her life, she knew she was loved completely. The roses bloomed spectacularly that spring, reaching toward the sky without anyone to measure their height or complain about their color. They were wild and beautiful and free, a living monument to the daughter we had lost. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit in the garden and think about Margaret Hayes in her prison cell. I wondered if she could see the moon through her tiny window, if she remembered the morning she had destroyed 2 families with a single gunshot. I wondered if she understood that her obsession with control had cost her everything she had ever worked for. The investigation into Margaret's crimes had revealed the full extent of her corruption. She had stolen over $400,000 from the HOA over the years, using the money to pay for her lavish lifestyle while residents struggled to keep up with her arbitrary fines. She had filed false insurance claims, evaded taxes, and used her position to intimidate anyone who questioned her authority. Her house had been sold to pay restitution to the families she had cheated. Her bank accounts had been seized. Her pension had been revoked. The woman who had once lived in luxury was now dependent on prison food and state-issued uniforms. But more than her financial ruin, Margaret had lost something far more valuable: her reputation, her legacy, her place in the community she had tried so hard to control. She would be remembered not as a devoted community leader, but as the woman who killed a baby over the height of roses. People ask me if I feel guilty about my revenge. They wonder if I went too far in exposing her crimes and orchestrating her downfall. But I sleep peacefully at night, knowing that Emma's killer will never again hurt an innocent child. The truth is, I didn't destroy Margaret Hayes. She destroyed herself the moment she decided that her petty rules were more important than human life. I simply made sure the world saw her for what she really was: a corrupt, racist, murderous woman who had hidden behind a facade of community service. Some people might call what I did revenge, but I call it justice. Margaret Hayes had spent years terrorizing innocent families, using her position to intimidate and harass anyone who didn't meet her impossible standards. She had committed crimes while presenting herself as a moral authority. She had killed my daughter and then complained about property values while Emma died in my arms. Every revelation about Margaret's corruption, every lawsuit filed against her, every moment of public humiliation she endured, it was all justified by the magnitude of her crimes. She had taken everything from us, and she deserved to lose everything in return. Margaret Hayes thought she was dealing with just another young father who would quietly accept her abuse. She had no idea that she was threatening the child of a man trained to eliminate threats with surgical precision. She learned too late that some enemies are too dangerous to make. The neighborhood she had worked so hard to control fell apart after her arrest. Without her iron fist enforcing the rules, residents began to relax. Children played in the streets again. Families hosted barbecues without fear of noise complaints. The HOA dissolved within 6 months, unable to function without its tyrannical leader. In a strange way, Margaret's downfall brought the community together. The families she had terrorized found solidarity in their shared experiences. The lawsuit I had initiated led to support groups for victims of HOA abuse. Laws were passed to prevent the kind of harassment Margaret had inflicted on so many families. Emma's death had meaning now. Her brief life had exposed a monster and protected future children from Margaret's rage. In losing our daughter, we had saved countless other families from similar tragedy. But none of that brought Emma back. None of that gave us back the future we had planned with our daughter. Margaret's suffering couldn't restore the birthdays we would never celebrate, the first steps we would never see, the wedding we would never attend. Emma is gone, and nothing will ever bring her back. But her killer is exactly where she belongs, locked away from the world she tried so hard to control, suffering every day for what she took from us. In the end, that's the only justice a father can hope for. The roses in Emma's garden bloom brighter every year, reaching toward the sky without anyone to tell them they're too tall. In their beauty I find peace. In Margaret's suffering I find justice. In Sarah's slowly healing heart, I find hope for the future. Some people might say I went too far. But they never held their dying daughter in their arms while her killer stood watching. They never felt the rage that comes from absolute helplessness, or the cold satisfaction of perfect revenge. Margaret Hayes shot my baby daughter in front of my wife, unaware that she was making an enemy of a man who had spent his life learning how to destroy those who threatened the innocent. She paid for that mistake with everything she had ever worked for, and she'll spend the rest of her life paying for it. That's not revenge. That's justice. And Emma's roses continue to grow beautiful and free, just as she should have been.